Okay, everyone, welcome to the webinar, Help is on the Line, Providing Hotline Services for Incarcerated Survivors. This webinar is brought to you by the Resource Sharing Project, as well as Just Detention International. And I have two folks from Just Detention International joining the webinar today that I'm so excited to have. We will have Gwen. Gwen is a Senior Program Director with Just Detention International. Gwen has decades of experience working to make detention facilities safe. A member of JDI's domestic programs team, she helps corrections agencies prevent and respond to sexual abuse in detention and works to ensure that incarcerated survivors receive crisis counseling from local service providers. Gwen is one of the supervisors of JDI's Emotional Support Crisis Line for incarcerated survivors. We also have Nicole. Nicole is a Senior Program Officer at JDI's Washington, D.C. office. As a member of the Domestic Programs team, she assists with providing training and technical assistance to corrections agencies, supporting their implementation of the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards. Nicole is one of the advocates who responds to calls from incarcerated survivors to JDI's Emotional Support Crisis Line. We're so excited to have both Nicole and Gwen, who you will hear from throughout the webinar. Nicole, would you like to introduce JDI?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for that introduction, Leah, and I'm so glad to be back for another webinar with you all. JDI is really pleased to partner with the Resource Sharing Project to present this webinar. But yeah, before we get into the webinar, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about JDI. So Just Detention International is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual violence in all forms of detention, including adult prisons and jails, juvenile facilities, lockups, community confinement settings, and immigration detention. Our core goals are to work with corrections officials and allied professionals to end sexual abuse in detention, to educate the public and allied professionals about sexual abuse in detention, and to support survivors of this form of abuse. We believe that rape is not part of the penalty and that we can achieve the goal of ending sexual violence in detention. JDI greatly values working with victim advocates because the services you provide are critical to helping inmate survivors heal. And we'd like to thank you in advance for the amazing work that you all are doing every day. So I will now turn things back over to Leah so that she can tell you a little bit more about the Resource Sharing Project.
Thanks, Nicole. So hopefully everyone on the webinar by now knows that this is a webinar brought to you by the Resource Sharing Project and our Rural Training and Technical Assistance team. Our Rural Training and Technical Assistance Project seeks to enhance the capacity of rural dual multi-service advocacy programs to provide strong sexual assault services. And we have done that in this most recent grant cycle by partnering with Just Detention International to bring a lot of really targeted training and technical assistance about PREA and working with incarcerated survivors. And we're just really grateful to have this partnership with JDI so that we can bring that information to you. As we do with all of our webinars, as we go through, feel free to put questions in the chat box. We may answer those as we go forward, but if not, we will definitely have a lot of time at the end to answer all the questions that you guys have. So feel free to put questions and comments and really participate in the webinar. Our webinar objectives today, we're going to learn about best practices for establishing your hotline services. We're going to address some key challenges of providing those hotline services in incarceration or detention facilities, and explore how to adapt your advocacy skills that you already all possess for working with incarcerated clients. So today we're going to just provide a bit of a roadmap for really providing hotline services for incarcerated survivors. Then we're going to go on to talking about how to prepare for actually receiving some of those phone calls. Of course, we want to go over how we ensure the sustainability of our hotline services for incarcerated folks. And then at the end, we will have a bit of a Q&A. So this is just a reminder to make sure you take care of yourself while on the webinar today. We are recording this webinar, and so we will be captioning the recording, putting it on our website. I believe JDI will also put it on their website. So if at any point you need to step away, take care of yourself, take care of other business, just know that we'll still have a recording going moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leah. So yeah, before we jump in, I'd love to just get a sense of how many folks on the line might already be providing hotline services to incarcerated survivors. So let's take a quick minute to answer this poll if you don't mind, and Leah's just posted that for us. So are you currently providing hotline services to incarcerated survivors? Yes, and we have a formal agreement with one or more facilities to provide the service. Yes. B, yes, we are providing, we are receiving calls from incarcerated survivors, but we do not have a formal agreement with facilities. Or C, no, we do not provide hotline services currently. So let's just take a minute to answer that.
Okay.
And Leah, just feel free to, yep.
Sure, like 5 more seconds to answer, and then we're going to close it. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll, and the results should be on your screen.
Oh, great. So it looks like a lot of you are already providing services and you have some sort of formal agreement. That's wonderful. Hopefully we can, for those of you who are providing services and those of you who are not, hopefully we can address some of the issues that you've had or concerns that you may have for those of you who don't have agreements yet. So this is great. This is really helpful. Thank you so much for answering. If you'll entertain me for just another poll question, we also wanted to ask you guys how comfortable you're feeling about providing services to incarcerated survivors. And please, be as honest as you feel comfortable with. But I'm going to have Leah, bring up that question. So yeah, how comfortable are you serving incarcerated survivors at this time? Very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, or not at all comfortable?
Okay, just about 5 more seconds and then we'll close that up. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. And there are the results.
Great, thank you. Okay, so it looks like most of you are somewhat comfortable, and a lot of you are very comfortable. That's great. And then a couple of you said not at all comfortable. Great. So hopefully, like I said, we can provide you all with some helpful information today and answer some of your concerns and make that 10% of you feel more comfortable about working with incarcerated survivors. So thank you again for participating in both of those polls. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So most of you are probably familiar with PREA by now, or the Prison Rape Elimination Act. So let's take a look at the provisions from PREA that are relevant to today's discussion. Here's what PREA says about providing hotline services. The facility shall provide inmates with access to outside victim advocates for emotional support services related to sexual abuse by giving inmates mailing addresses and telephone numbers, including toll-free hotline numbers where available. So this is an excerpt from Standard 115.33 on inmate access to outside confidential support services. We'll review some additional key components of this PREA standard in just a bit, but for now we wanted to highlight this piece. Note that this PREA standard applies to prisons, jails, juvenile facilities, and community confinement facilities as well. So what are the benefits to providing hotline services? First, like for folks in the community, it's the fastest and most direct way for inmates to receive outside support services. And for the people behind bars, it's the only way to get immediate confidential help since they cannot physically go to a community provider. They can turn to mental health providers in the facility, but those conversations will not be confidential since all staff working within a facility are mandated reporters. Also, while they are well-qualified professionals, a facility's mental health staff may not have extensive expertise on working with victims of sexual abuse and other trauma. Although there are some aspects of using the phones that inmates cannot control, which we'll talk about soon, accessing an advocate on the phone can be a very empowering action for an incarcerated survivor and give them some sense of control over their situation. By accessing the hotline, they are deciding to talk to someone about what's happened to them. They're taking that step to seek help, and they're deciding what they want to share with you. And lastly, for advocates, it's a benefit because you can easily incorporate the program into your existing hotline services. We'll talk about some ways in which these calls may look a bit different than calls you are getting from the community, but ultimately you don't need to reinvent the wheel here or manage a separate hotline. Hopefully, some of you were with us last month when we talked to Troy Isaac, a survivor of sexual abuse in detention, about the importance of advocacy services for incarcerated survivors. Here's another one of JDI's Survivor Council members, Frank Mendoza. Frank has said, "If I had an advocate, it would have saved me so much grief. It would have helped me through the traumatic event immensely. Going through it alone, I didn't know who I could trust and who I could talk to about it, which appeared to be nobody." And this sentiment is something we hear from survivors frequently, that they didn't have anyone they could talk to, anyone they could trust. Again, we just wanted to highlight what a profound impact you can have as an advocate on an incarcerated survivor, even from just one phone call. Okay, so let's talk about the first steps in getting a hotline program started. It is so important that you are on the same page with the correctional facility on several items, such as hotline logistics and technology, confidentiality, privacy, and off-topic calls. So let's go over each one of these in more detail. While many community hotline numbers are available 24/7, it usually won't make sense for your hotline services within a detention facility to be offered 24/7. Because phones are usually located in communal areas and not inside detention cells, incarcerated people may only have access to phones during certain hours. On the flip side, you may decide as an agency that you want to limit the hours of services on your end. This may be because you don't currently run a hotline that's available 24/7, or maybe because you won't have trained staff available after business hours and you prefer volunteers not take these calls. Another logistical concern is what number inmates will call. Sometimes they'll dial your regular hotline number, or the facility will have them dial a code or a PIN that will connect them to you. For example, we work with an agency where inmates dial pound 55 and they get directed to an answering service that says something like, "Press 1 to report PREA incident," or "Press 2 to be connected with an outside advocate." It's critical in order to maintain confidentiality that the inmate not be required to enter their inmate ID in order to make the call. We'll talk a little bit more about confidentiality later in the webinar. One very common issue in detention facilities is that that's different in the communities, is that inmates typically have a time limit for these calls, or for all of their calls. It's usually about 15 minutes, and most agencies give the callers a warning when the call is coming to an end. Make sure to ask your facility about this and inform your advocate so that they can plan to check in with the survivor before the call wraps up to discuss any follow-up actions. You also want to make sure you discuss accessibility with your facilities to make sure you have a plan for addressing callers who have limited English proficiency and callers who are deaf or hard of hearing. Most facilities also have an automatic recording for people receiving calls. It usually says something like, "An inmate from X facility is attempting to reach you. To accept this call, press 1. Sometimes the inmate's recorded name will also be shared. So ask the facility about this type of announcement so that your advocates can be prepared for the call. Depending on the scope of your program and your existing hotline practices, you may be using a third-party answering service that connects you to callers. Make sure that they have any specific instructions for these calls. For example, who's on shift and who's the backup on shift, what to do if the line is busy, or what to tell the survivor if they're calling during non-hotline hours. In addition to this answering service, keep in mind that the facility will have to work things out on their end with their telephone provider. Everything from what number inmates dial to questions about confidentiality. All these systems should be tested before launching any hotline and periodically thereafter. All right, I mentioned confidentiality a couple times already, so let's dig a little deeper into that topic. Here's what PREA has to say about it. The facility shall enable reasonable communication between inmates and these organizations and agencies in as confidential manner as possible. The facility shall inform inmates prior to giving them access of the extent to which such communication will be monitored and the extent to which reports of abuse will be forwarded to authorities in accordance with mandatory reporting laws. Most correctional facilities monitor and record telephone communications. So talk to them about how they can make your calls, your hotline calls, as confidential as possible per the PREA requirements. It may be that their phones can be programmed so that when an inmate calls the number to your hotline, the system automatically stops recording and doesn't allow staff to listen in. It's helpful to ask what they do for attorney calls, which are also required to be confidential. Also, inmates are typically required to enter an ID number when making calls, which means the calls won't be anonymous. So this is also something you'll want to discuss with the facility. Ultimately, if the facility decides it must record and or monitor these calls, PREA requires them to let inmates know in advance. But it's good practice for you as an advocate to mention it at the beginning of your calls as well. At JDI, we've worked to develop many partnerships between corrections agencies and rape crisis centers, and by far, the #1 topic is always confidentiality. In the corrections world, safety and security are top priorities. So it can be difficult at times for corrections officials to accept that inmates should be able to speak confidentially about abuse that has occurred in their facility. However, as an advocate, we recognize that the victim's choice to report is a very important step in their healing process. When inmates have the opportunity to speak confidentially with an advocate, they are in fact more likely to disclose the abuse to the facility. Have an open discussion with the agency you are working with and make sure they understand your confidentiality requirements set forth by your organization and your state, as well as the important benefits of confidential services for survivors. Something else we wanted to flag is that the type of hotline we're discussing here today is for confidential emotional support and is not to be confused with a reporting line. The PREA standards require corrections facilities to have an outside reporting entity for inmates, and in some places, facilities have asked the local rape crisis center or even the state coalition to serve as this reporting option. While some programs serve the dual role of being a reporting line and providing confidential support services, this is not best practice. Make sure the facility understands that this is not a reporting line and that you will not forward reports to them. And if you have questions on this issue, please flag them in the chat box so that we can address them during the Q&A. Off-topic calls are likely to occur, especially at the beginning of any hotline program. Some inmates may call just to, out of curiosity to find out what this new hotline is all about. Because inmates have such limited resources, they may try to use this free call to reach family members or ask for legal assistance as well. You can develop standard language to address these calls that briefly explains to inmates that the hotline is not for that and what you are able to assist them with. You'll want to talk to the facility partners about repeat offenders and people who are abusing the line or who are disrespectful to your advocates. Okay, a quick webinar reminder. If you have questions, please submit them in the chat box. So we've gone over a lot of logistical details, and I'm going to take a break from doing all this talking and introduce my colleague Gwen, who's going to talk a little bit about MOUs. Hey, Gwen. Looks like Gwen is
Thanks,
muted.
Nicole.
Oh, there we go.
I'm here now, yeah. Nick, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's really exciting to see so many of you from around the country joining us today, and I'm really seeing some excellent points being raised in our chat box. Hopefully everyone's looking at the chat box while you're simultaneously participating, listening, and looking at our slides. And many of you have experienced so much with clients in the community. So, and as we saw in our poll earlier, 59% it said that you are already providing services to incarcerated survivors. You've got an MOU in place. Another 15% are providing those services even though you don't have an MOU in place. So it's really wonderful to hear that there's just so many great things happening out there for and on behalf of incarcerated survivors. Thank you so much for your work. We do want to go into a little bit more detail though, and hopefully we'll continue to see some questions that I'm noticing happening that we can explore in our conversation in the question and answer period. As we look forward to providing services for incarcerated survivors, we especially want to keep in mind how important these hotline services are in terms of their healing. It's just so vital to their healing, as it is to anyone who is a survivor. The critical step when initiating a successful collaboration, as those 59% of you know, is really being able to negotiate with your corrections partner a successful MOU, memorandum of understanding, that's really going to meet the needs of both parties. And some of you may know these as memorandum of agreement or MOAs. If you have partnerships with federal facilities, you might know them as a GSA or a gratuitous services agreement. But it doesn't really matter what the title is. What's important is that it spells out or details how you're going to work together and who's going to do what, where, when, how you're going to fund those activities. It's going to be especially familiar and commonplace to anyone who's got a partnership in place of any type for other aspects of your victim services. I'm really looking through the comments I see. There are a number of you that have been working in various levels. I see prisons happening here. I see jail partnerships happening. But some of the basic elements in developing these MOUs for your hotline services should really include coming to the table with an open mind, just as you would entering into any conversation or discussion where you've got to negotiate. Keep your mind open, but be sure you're bringing the right players to the table. You want to establish regular in-person meetings. Critical that you bring yourselves together in person, look each other in the eye until you have those MOUs signed. Really follow through with those meetings. Describe the commitments of each party and develop along with that MOU a multi-phase plan as to how you're going to implement each of your duties, your roles and responsibilities. Remember, as you're putting this together, to be sure you're at all times considering the needs of your survivors. That's why we're doing this in the first place. Be creative, think as broadly as you can about solutions, because you're going to run into some roadblocks and challenges in working with a correction setting. A closed, incarcerated setting makes naturally for some challenges, so be flexible. I do have a word of caution for you. You'll find that your advocacy organization might be approached by a corrections facility because they're about to receive a PREA audit. When they have their Prison Rape Elimination Act audit team approaching them, or the date on the calendar for that audit team to come in, they're feeling pressured to get that victim services partnership in place if they haven't already done so. So they might be knocking on your door and saying, here, let's sign this MOU together. Let's get this into place. And as a result, they might just be doing it to be compliant with the PREA standard. It's going to be a poorly negotiated MOU. In fact, not really any negotiation at all. And it could set you up with unrealistic expectations and shortcomings, not to mention that it fails to demonstrate any really meaningful compliance on their part. And a good auditor is going to pick up on that. So you may have experienced this already, and hopefully you were aware of what was happening and didn't feel pressured into signing on the dotted line without some due caution. Some correctional facilities have even been known to stop responding to attempted communication from you or from the advocacy partner after that PREA audit and MOU has been put in place. And let's talk about why this might be. Maybe it's a little bit obvious, but most likely the motivation was because they wanted that partnership just to be able to check those boxes for the audit, and it didn't really meet the spirit and intent of providing those meaningful services for the incarcerated survivor. Again, let's go back to remembering putting that MOU in place is considering the needs of the survivors, not simply to meet an audit. So how can we avoid this? Well, I mentioned some of the basic elements that we need to include. So let's look a little bit more closely at where we begin. When we start with that open mind, we want to initiate our MOU development process by setting up that series of really well-planned face-to-face meetings. Well-planned meaning let's be sure we're putting agendas together for each meeting, so we're not just spinning our wheels each time around. When we look at the players that we want to come to the table, key is, who are those players? What titles do they hold? Because this can really make or break your progress and ultimately your success. For your part, you want the head of your advocacy organization, you want your victim services program coordinator or the equivalent person, and you want someone who really is responsible and leads your hotline, someone in a supervisory capacity. And I'm talking about people here, as you might have noticed, that are in decision-making positions that can, on the spot, be negotiating for your organization in that MOU team, on that MOU team. For the corrections agency, same thing. You want to make sure that they are bringing to the table the senior official for whether it's a local corrections facility, might be someone like the jail administrator, state facility could be, or federal facility, the prison warden. They carry different titles, but you get the gist. You want the second in command, the administrative lieutenant or sergeant, because oftentimes that go-to person is going to be the one you're going to get the greatest access to things you need to get done in a hurry once your MOU is in place. The chief of security is a really important person. That person is going to have a lot of questions about how security is going to be maintained when inmates are allowed to make unmonitored, unrecorded phone calls to your hotline. We've found that having someone from medical or mental health services, someone in a head capacity role there, has been helpful, because they're going to want to understand, all right, so when an inmate or incarcerated survivor calls the hotline or crisis response line, how is that different than them coming to someone in a facility in our mental health department receiving therapeutic services? So talk through that with them and explain, make sure they understand the difference and what your specialty area is in providing emotional support in the moment of crisis compared to the therapy that they provide. It isn't, even though we think it might be clear, it isn't often clear to them. The corrections agency liaison for the inmate telephone service provider is a really key person to have involved. You want to ensure that the technological, logistical, and confidentiality matters are going to be addressed. That we have found has been a real key sticking point in some instances in negotiating MOUs. And then naturally, you want the PREA coordinator for the jurisdiction. This is the person that is the senior most PREA team leader for that jurisdiction, whether it's the state, the federal corrections entity or locality, the community corrections, the juvenile corrections, what have you. And then the PREA compliance manager. That's the person at the facility that manages all things PREA within the facility. Now remember, the PREA coordinator is the one at the broader level for the agency, corrections agency, and then at the facility it's the PREA compliance manager. They might juggle those titles a little bit, and the standards, that's how those titles are referred to. So these are some of the many positions and roles that we find are instrumental to ensuring access to your hotline by a survivor is going to be able to flow smoothly and successfully, but you might find that others are going to be identified that you think in your area would be really helpful as well. Nicole mentioned, of course, the tour of the facilities should be a part of your agenda for your first in-person meeting. I really think that's very critical. It's going to, again, help you gain that understanding of the overall facility environment, but it's also going to identify for you just where are those inmate phones located? What are some of those barriers around where those phones are placed for an inmate to actually be able to hear you on the other end, for them to be able to speak privately enough with enough confidence that they can communicate to you without those very difficult conversations happening in earshot of others. Or if it does happen within earshot of others, how are you going to be able to help calm them if they're having difficulty with managing and coping in a difficult conversation? You might also have an opportunity to visit with other facility staff during a tour, or maybe in some of the inmates. Whether or not they're survivors may not be as important as just making that connection and informally chatting with them about your services and helping them know that you're going to be bringing services to the facility. It may just be by way of phone, maybe that eventually you'll be doing that in person. At this point, making them aware that you're there is important. Do those in-person meetings, both the advocacy program and corrections facility or agency officials. During those meetings, you want to be sure that you're seeking to clearly articulate what each of you understands in your own roles and responsibilities in that partnership, but also try to do the converse. Say, so here's what I understand my role to be. This is what I understand your role to be. And play that back for them in your own words and see if they say, no, that's not what we understood. It's important because oftentimes there can be miscommunication that way. And as I said, get that multi-phased implementation plan in place. Your MOU should also include services that will be provided connected to any kinds of fees or reimbursements that corrections facility might be able to pay your advocacy program for its work if you don't have other sources of funding, or in addition to other sources of funding to accomplish what you want to set into motion with your MOU. The MOU will also define any important concepts. Some of these Nicole went over, such as confidentiality. The advocacy program is going to want to review with the facility its procedures for inmate phone calls. Each party's definition of what constitutes confidentiality as it relates to a survivor phone call should be discussed. And I bring this up because Just Detention International actually experienced this. We got more than a year into an MOU regarding inmate phone services and realized that we weren't defining the word confidentiality the same way that the corrections agency was. And who would have known that we would have had different definitions of that? But we certainly know now that that's one of the things that we always should talk through and say, okay, what within your definition of confidentiality, what does that look like for you? Make sure that the facility thoroughly explains its reporting options and its response protocol, because this is going to be relevant for you to understand your roles and responsibilities when an incarcerated survivor discloses their knowledge of any kind of imminent danger of sexual violence against themselves or another inmate, or reports a sexual assault. After several meetings, you'll then, and of course, thorough research that you've done along the way and these conversations, then negotiate that confidentiality through the MOU process. If you jump into negotiating confidentiality too soon in the MOU process, you may find that you're continually having to revamp it, because as things evolve in your understanding, you'll say, that confidentiality definition isn't going to work for us here. We now have more information and we need to revisit this. At all times, consider the needs of the survivor, as I said, and throughout the process, the partners must not shy away from asking the tough questions of one another. It's difficult to develop trust because we come from such different worlds, but really, really work hard to unpack your concerns related to things like confidentiality and privacy and security. That's part of the way you're going to help develop trust with one another. Remember too, please, that as we've talked about, corrections facilities are required under those PREA standards to attempt to work with victim services providers. And this is a fact that can actually be leveraged during negotiations in a healthy way. It's helpful to share that reducing an incarcerated survivor's trauma can help create a calmer, more manageable environment, which thus is safer and more secure facility for both the inmates in the facility and the staff alike. And staff understand that. They see that as a connection to their mission. And there are going to be setbacks naturally in the negotiating process as you develop the MOU, but just remember to remain calm, think creatively, be flexible, as I mentioned. Your common goals come into play. The well-being of the people in the facility, housed in the facility, helping to bring them to a place where they're healthier, helps prepare them to return to the community. And helping them with their trauma helps bring them to that better, calmer place in their life. These two worlds, as I mentioned, are very different. Bringing them together can be a challenge, but it also can be very fulfilling. And I hope that for those of you who have MOUs in place, that you're finding that you have a productive, supportive MOU rather than one that is constantly sort of compromising your partnership. If you have one that's compromising your partnership, take a step back and look at the issues that might need to be renegotiated, modified, an addendum to the MOU. It's important that you have it work for you and take the time to revisit the things that aren't working for you. For the 15% of you that said, yes, we are providing services to incarcerated survivors, but we don't have an MOU in place, I hope that what I've just shared with you will help you move toward developing those. And then the other 26% that don't have services to incarcerated survivors in place yet, or hotline services, we're hoping by the end of this webinar, you'll be taking a closer look at that. I'm excited now to shift to a different direction in our conversation today. We've got a guest with us, Michelle Powell. Really, really honored to have her here. I consider Michelle both a colleague and a friend. I had the privilege of first meeting her a year ago, or just over a year ago now, and working with her and her agency, the Goshen County Task Force on Family Violence and Sexual Assault. You can see her on the screen here. June of 2017, Just Detention International first provided training and technical assistance for the 5 Wyoming state prisons and their local victim services agencies. And Michelle happens to be the Sexual Assault and Education Coordinator for Goshen County Task Force. They're located in Torrington, Wyoming. And she was one of the ones we got to work with. She has been doing domestic violence and sexual assault work as a coordinator and an advocate for 15 years for the task force. But it's been since 2014 that Michelle, along with 6 other advocates from the Goshen County Task Force, that have been answering the crisis hotline for incarcerated survivors there in the local community and visiting the inmates at the Wyoming Medium Correctional Institution located in Torrington. Michelle is also a volunteer for the Wyoming Correctional Facility. She has gone through the training and carries their volunteer card, which allows her access to the facilities to do that work. And so, Michelle, I'm just been so grateful for the time that you've invested in working with me to help prepare for our presentation and our conversation today to share with everyone. And thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Gwen.
So, Michelle, before I ask you the first question, I just wanted to let everyone know during the conversation that the pictures that they're going to be seeing are personal art expressions that are created by survivors, both male and female, men and women survivors, that are housed at the Montgomery County, Maryland Department of Correction and Rehabilitation. And these expressions of art, some of them are writings. These were done during Sexual Assault Awareness Month this year. And so we're really pleased to be able to share that with you too. Michelle, I imagine our audience is really interested in hearing a bit more about how you came to work with incarcerated survivors. I happen to know about this, and some of them may find it to be a somewhat common path. Would you please share a little bit about that?
Sure, Gwen. So the captain of the prison in our area reached out to our organization in 2014. The prison actually was preparing for their PREA audit they were having in 2015. So they were getting everything put in place. Prior to that, we started getting letters from inmates about sexual assault, and they were mentioning JDI, and at that time we had absolutely no idea who JDI was. So this was around 2010, 2011, but because of confidentiality, we really didn't know what to do, so we never wrote back to the inmates, and we didn't do anything about it.
Well, and I really appreciate webinars like this where we have an opportunity to help, make a connection with more advocates. So if they do get letters, they know, oh, JDI, now I know who they are. Some of our listeners also may be experiencing something similar. And so, Michelle, if you could tell us a little bit about that first incarcerated survivor that you worked with on the hotline, and how did you feel about that? What kind of feelings or thoughts did you have during that first call?
Sure. So our very first call was an officer calling me to tell me about a sexual assault incident that took place and that an inmate was requesting to talk with an advocate. I absolutely was surprised to receive the call. My heart was pounding. I can still remember it to this day, that feeling of just the unknown, the fear of the unknown. The prison process is to put the victim in segregation for protection following the report. The victim requested to come out and talk, for us to come out and talk with him. I was never out at the prison to talk with incarcerated survivors. Like I said before, I was so scared because I didn't know who I was meeting and what the prison process would be like. We already have a buddy system in place with our clients on the outside where we always respond in pairs. It's more of a safety precaution we have. So there was 2 of us that went out to the prison together. The officer took us back to the segregated housing area and allowed us to speak in that area where there was no other inmates or the staff. The officer stayed behind the locked doors, which I knew the officer could see us if we were in any kind of trouble, so that made me feel a little bit safer. And at that point, it was more about how do we start this conversation.
Mm-hmm. And Michelle mentioned some really key points here. I see that Megan asked or talked a little bit about in the let's see, the chat. We'll get to this a little bit more about rights of incarcerated survivors. I'm going to talk about that here. I think it's important. You know, that it's clear that that first experience with an incarcerated survivor was impactful for you. You know, how did your reaction to receiving that call on the hotline um, from, you know, whether it's from an incarcerated survivor or a prison employee about a sexual assault charge, how did it change you as a result?
So basically, the first survivor taught me a lot. We were able to do weekly visits with him for about a month and a half. He taught us a lot. He was 18 years old. He was a lower functioning, very vulnerable. He'd been in the system his whole life. He had absolutely became a target. And it was also during the holidays. He was scared. He was in prison for the first time, and he lost everything, like his legal papers, his personal belongings. And because he was moved to AgSeg for his protection, he could no longer go to his GED classes. He couldn't have access to supplies to draw or color, and he felt like this was a punishment to him. And that made me become very angry because I felt like here he is all by himself and had no one but us to help him, and we were it. And after talking to him, I realized that they were doing this for his safety. The staff was absolutely wonderful. They never gave us any trouble. They did recommend for him to see a therapist at the prison, which we think definitely made sense. But as advocates, we provide crisis counseling. We did our job, and we had to move on when our job was done. And we definitely couldn't become personally invested.
Mm-hmm. You know, and so that's difficult at times. Like you said, you had a lot of emotion around that, and you know, I want to address, take this minute. I think it's important for me to address some of the things that Michelle brought up around housing and that movement, and some of what feels very, very punitive. The PREA standards, and I'll specifically note them for those that might be interested. In the prison standards, prisons and jails, 115.43 and 115.68. 115.43 and 115.68. They say that people at high risk for sexual victimization or people who have made allegations of sexual abuse should not be placed in protective custody or ADSEG, administrative segregation, except as a last resort. So the facility should consider other available alternatives. And if the facility must house someone in ADSEG for their safety, that individual's stay in administrative segregation should not exceed 30 days. Additionally, as Michelle mentioned, her client was unable to attend GED classes, and the standards also say that inmates placed in segregated housing for the purpose of their protection, they should still have access to programming and to other privileges that they would have if they were in what we refer to as general population, general housing. And this, of course, includes things like that education, but also work opportunities, library, recreation, normal time out of cell, showering opportunities to the greatest extent possible. So Michelle, let me ask just a little bit more questions here, if you don't mind. What can you tell us? Thank you. What can you tell us about building, how to build trust with an incarcerated survivor who calls the hotline? You know, they have a lot of trust issues, and especially in an incarcerated setting, what kinds of challenges are there to building trust? Are they really different with incarcerated survivors versus a survivor calling in from the community?
So I would say absolutely there's no difference. I'm here to listen. Okay. I'm to help. I'm a resource. I don't see any difference in that trust building process. It is personal. I'm here to provide a service so we can all work together. I trust no matter what. I am not here to investigate. I don't treat any incarcerated survivor any different than any other caller on my hotline. And this could be huge from the inmate's perspective. So it's more about how can I build their trust and make them feel comfortable. And that's what we're here is to listen and not judge. In fact, we serve, our prison serves only male incarcerated people. So that's the population that our service area is. So since we don't get many male survivors coming to us for our services in the community, this did take some getting used to. And obviously it takes a lot for the inmates to reach out to us through our hotlines, whether that is incarcerated or from the community.
I see. Can you think about different kinds of things that you did that you had to learn to work effectively with incarcerated survivors that were calling?
Any differently? I would say no, nothing that I would be any different than what I would be with our people within the community. It's just, and it is hard to work with male survivors in general, because it's hard for them to reach out and then speak with, actually, because we only have female advocates on staff. So it is trying to build their trust and let them know we're not here to judge, and whatever we can do to be their resource.
Okay. Well, what about different kinds of things that you had to learn to work really effectively with incarcerated survivors? What kinds of things did you learn, I should say?
Okay. So what I've learned is that I don't work for the correctional facility. I'm here to provide a service to any survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault. I'm not here to explain anything to the correctional staff. We can agree to disagree respectfully and professionally. It's not like I'm going to lose my job. In fact, I could lose my job and my license if I don't maintain confidentiality. And I've learned not to be intimidated. The correction officers, they're people too. They go home to their families. It's a lot like working with our prosecuting attorneys and police and in different cases from the community.
We all have our role in serving and supporting incarcerated survivors, and I see that clearly. What are some of the differences in the way that you might help an incarcerated survivor who's in crisis as compared to a caller from the community? For example, if are there certain grounding techniques that you can use with a community caller, let's say, that you would not be able to use with an incarcerated caller?
Yeah, a little bit. I can't necessarily reach out and tell them to reach out to their support system if that support system isn't in a prison and they can't reach out to any of their family members at that time. The similarities are that they may know their perpetrator and they are likely under the same roof with them, like as in the community. I can't tell them to journal their feelings. They may not. It may not be safe route for them to go if the incarcerated, if anybody finds their notes. Let's see. There's very few of the incarcerated survivors I hear from on the hotline have disclosed. Most keep it a secret. We talk about how are we going to keep you safe until you get out. I've never had an inmate call me right after an incident. The ones who normally call are talking about the flashbacks that they're experiencing. It's been the same with survivors from the community. If they're in a panic mode from trauma, resorting to a flashback, I use grounding exercises that can be done in place in the moment, like breathing, visualizing techniques, and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really helpful. How I'm asking a lot of these hows, but I think it's helpful. How would you assist an incarcerated survivor who's expressing suicidal intentions while you're on the call?
So I would follow the same steps that I would do with any caller on the outside. I would try and get as much personal information about them, such as their name, maybe their facility, if they're willing to give that to me. Ask them what they're feeling at that moment. Discuss ways to keep them safe. Is there anyone they can talk to there that they feel safe with? I'd ask them if there was any way that they could call me back maybe the next day to check in with me. And if I felt that I couldn't get them calmed down and that things might be a little bit more serious and that they're going to carry out some of those thoughts, their suicidal intentions, I would definitely call my director. And then we would have to report to the prison and let them know. Honestly, I've never had that happen. I've had more inmates that have called that had like mental health issues, and what they were telling me was pretty far out, but it was his reality at that time. So my job was to help him through that moment and guide him and encourage him to talk with the PREA person at that prison. I must do my job to help them stay calm in that situation. And I would do nothing different with other people of the community.
And I think as you described your scenario and how you would contact your director, and then you'd contact the prison directly. I think it's really important in your MOU process and then in putting your multi-phase plan together and implementation. These are one of the things. This is one of the areas you really want to talk through in those emergency situations. If you find that there's whether it's harm to self, harm to another, suicidal, homicidal situation, you really need to know how you're going to handle that process and under what circumstances, because it will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In some situations, the agency may want you to contact, rather than contacting the facility directly, they may want you to contact the PREA coordinator at the agency level, and then they will contact the facility. So, and if you can't get any identifying information from the individual, if we have an unmonitored, unrecorded call that is not traceable back to the facility because it's a universal PIN number rather than any identifiable PIN, we're not going to know who that caller is or where they're calling from if we're serving a jurisdiction with multiple facilities. So, we just have to do the best we can, as you described, in trying to help that individual in terms of their safety and getting them to calm down and encouraging them to seek help for mental health within the facility, and hopefully to contact us back so that we know that they have calmed down and that they haven't acted upon any harm to self or harm to others, in the event that we're not able to get anyone back to them because we don't have enough identifying information. And those scenarios happen in the community too. Michelle, why do you think it's important to provide hotline services to incarcerated survivors? Just a really fundamental question.
So we're their first access to be able to talk with somebody that is, first of all, not on the prison payroll. We're confidential, and we're their first responders. And they have all those services in one. There's a process for them to be able to talk to like their caseworker or their therapist in prison, and that takes time. And also remember, those conversations are not confidential because the facility is mandated reporters. But they can actually reach out to us quickly, and we're not on the dime of the facility. And we don't have to answer any questions from the prison.
Okay. That's great. How has being a part of this effort impacted you in your work, or even perhaps on a personal level?
So like I explained earlier, the first incarcerated survivor taught me a lot. They're not scary people. At first I thought, oh my goodness, what if I'm speaking with a murderer? What are they going to do to me? Can they hurt me? But they taught me that they're human beings as well. It's not my business why they're locked up. I don't ask survivors in the community their criminal history. Why would I ask them? They're just actually just as uncomfortable wondering what we're thinking about them. Their issues are a bit more complicated because they have more challenges since they're incarcerated. They actually have better manners than most of the people I have encountered in the community.
Okay. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our advocates or those listening today about helping incarcerated survivors?
I do, and there's so much, but I know we're on limited time. But I think it's really important, if you can take anything out of this webinar, is don't change the way you do advocacy just because they're incarcerated. Yes, they have different challenges, but every call I get is a different challenge. And that's why we need to, remind them that they're not alone. And that's, and that's pretty much it. Yeah.
That's powerful. Thank you, Michelle. Really powerful.
No problem.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I know that we're seeing so many questions coming in. So please stick around. It's going to be important for us to have you be a part of our Q&A. Nicole?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks so much, Gwen and Michelle. It was really helpful to hear about your experience, Michelle, and we really appreciate it. If folks have additional questions for Michelle, please submit them, and we'll try to get to them during the Q&A. I see we have a lot of questions, so I will be quick about these next couple of slides. So earlier we talked about all the background work that needs to happen before you set up your hotline program. So now let's discuss how to prepare for the actual calls before we wrap up today's webinar. So before advocates start taking calls, you'll want to make sure your staff and volunteers, or really anyone who's answering the hotline calls, that they're trained and that they're comfortable talking to incarcerated survivors. Advocates don't necessarily need any extensive additional training, as Michelle pointed out, but there are a few things that may differ from calls they deal with from the community. Make sure that they're aware about the call limits that we talked about, the time limits, how to handle callers who are threatening to harm themselves or others, which Michelle and Gwen just talked about as well. What to say to inmates about the degree to which the hotline is confidential, and basic facility procedures. For example, it will be helpful for advocates to know how inmates can make a report in the facility, how they can access medical help, how to reach the PREA coordinator, and we'll talk a little bit more about handling these calls in just a bit. You may also need to adjust your intake forms or create new ones for incarcerated survivors, since there might be some differences in the information that you track. Like, for example, if they disclose, you'll want to put the facility name, if you're working with more than one facility, if the abuse was by staff or by inmates, and the kind of follow-up actions that you're going to be taking. If you haven't already been to the facility you're working with, ask for a tour. We talked about this earlier. These are really, really common, and it will be so helpful to understand the conditions that people are living in, particularly when we talk about safety planning with survivors. If you're working with multiple facilities, be aware that they're all different. We talked about some of these differences in last month's webinar, like how, for example, prisons and jails have very different environments due to the nature of their population, but even two prisons that are part of the same system can have very different cultures. Also keep in mind, and this is especially important for rural advocates, that the inmate population of any prison you're working with may not necessarily match the local demographics. Advocates should be comfortable working with survivors of various ethnic and racial backgrounds. Also, familiarize yourself with available programs in the facility. They might have educational programs, faith-based programs, jobs, or volunteer opportunities. And for inmates, this might be really helpful for you to be able to refer them to those programs. Okay, let's go into a little more detail about how to handle some of these calls. So as I mentioned earlier, advocates don't really need extensive training on answering hotline calls for incarcerated victims. They'll be providing the same emotional support that they would provide to to victims in the community. They should validate the person's feelings, normalize their reactions to trauma, and provide that emotional support, and then any available resources. Of course, some interventions may need to be adapted a bit to fit the correction setting, and Michelle and Gwen talked a little bit about this as well, but offer coping skills that will work for their specific situation. For example, you're not going to want to suggest a yoga class unless you know that it's offered at the facility. Instead, you can talk to them about specific breathing or meditating exercises, or ask them if they have people in the facility that they can talk to. Sensory grounding techniques and journaling are good examples of coping skills that can easily be done in detention. However, like Michelle mentioned, journaling can sometimes be risky to survivors and should only be done if they feel safe, having those type of notes written down. And additionally, keep in mind that paper and pens are sometimes limited in facilities. Like in the community, tailor any safety plans to their specific circumstances. Does the person have friends or staff members who can provide support for them? Do they have family members that they can reach out to? If the survivor does not feel safe in their cell, can they make an emergency request to be moved? Can they go to medical? If they're in a crisis situation, how will they manage it? What options do they have? Is there an intercom or an alarm button? Remember that victims' perception of their own safety is what matters the most. So while it's helpful to brainstorm with them, it is important to let them make their own decisions about what is best. Explain to them their reporting options. For this, it might be helpful to ask the facility you're working with for a brochure. Most facilities provide inmates at intake a brochure that has all the reporting information, so it might be helpful to get a copy of that. Lastly, if it's appropriate and your agency has the capacity to do so, offer direct services. This means offer to call your contact at the facility on their behalf, to follow up with medical at the facility, to check in about having them moved, ask about the status of their investigation, etc. Of course, only do this if you have their explicit consent. I also want to note here that technical assistance for advocacy services is available through the Resource Sharing Project and Just Detention International, and perhaps also your state coalition. It could be helpful to check in with them to see what other programs in your state are doing in terms of providing services to incarcerated survivors. Okay, I'm going to go hand things back over to Gwen to discuss program sustainability.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So let's see, how do we keep hotline services for incarcerated survivors really strong and then meaningful for the long haul? So as with any healthy partnership, it's important to get to know one another. We've talked about that quite a bit. This means that you not only want to know those corrections facility team members, but also you want to know your agency level officials, whether that's the state PREA coordinator or those local folks like we talked about. But working as a first responder in the law enforcement field is incredibly stressful, just as it is working for a victim services agency. So there's a lot of turnover, a lot of high turnover among corrections staff. They rotate among facilities, move to central office, back to facilities, they retire, a lot of burnout and moving on. It's helpful for you to become familiar with more than just one key person. Talked about identifying many primary decision makers at both the facility level and the agency level, knowing the go-to support person like that administrative sergeant or lieutenant. Who carries the clout when it comes to accessing what you need in an emergency? And on the flip side, you want to make sure that they know your team and several people in your office as well. Don't just go to visit the facilities, but invite them to your offices so that they really get to know you and understand how you work. When you have those in-person meetings, go back and forth. You host them sometimes at your location, they host at their location. Of course, it's not just knowing who those players are, right? You want to have active, healthy lines of communication. So regularly checking in with your corrections partners is going to be key. You want to have that hotline be a recurring item on their facility staff meeting agenda with a representative from your agency attending in person that portion of the meeting. It's not going to always be possible, especially for rural agencies. Your capacity might be limited, but as it will allow, try to do that. You want to be prompt in addressing any issues that are going to arise when you have that hotline operating so that you don't overwhelm employees, you don't compromise your relationship with your partner, and you definitely don't want to be jeopardizing your service to incarcerated survivors. So when issues are happening, jump on that and get it resolved. Conduct outreach visits to the facility occasionally so that you can talk to the line staff, the folks that work directly in the housing units with the inmates and the survivors on different shifts. Find out when those shifts are. They run 12-hour shifts, they're going to have 2 a day. Do they run 8-hour shifts? They're going to have 3 a day. Informally chat with them, talk with the inmates. That's going to increase awareness about your services and answer any questions. It also is going to help build trust and support, as I talked about earlier. On a real practical level in sustaining your support line, you have to test it periodically. Again, that logistical issue. If you're not receiving phone calls from a particular housing unit or facility, get out there and find out what's going on, or get your corrections team to test it. It could be a logistical issue. Just as corrections staff burnout, though, I had talked about your team as well. Encourage self-care among your teams. See if you can offer corrections staff support by doing occasional training seminars or self-care activities for them for vicarious trauma. It's really going to help sustain the program and partnership as well. Sustaining the program is important for all of those reasons, but without funding, we can't have any of it. So get those sources of funding in place and look at your capacity beyond federal sexual assault funding. Here are some things you might have looked into. Take a second look. Services for incarcerated survivors, you might know there are newer funding streams available to advocacy, which means it might be possible for you to tap into state, local, and foundation grants where previously incarcerated survivors would not be an option among the populations that could be served with that funding. Private funding from individual donors, a little harder, takes more work to do sometimes, but it's important. They are in the community. When they find out your services are available and that's something you want to do, you might be able to access the right donor for this unique client base as well. And also your corrections agency partner, as we mentioned, there might be stipends available for them to reimburse for a portion of your costs, like travel costs to and from the facility, or to pay for some of these different kinds of activities, like you conducting staff training, or if they're working on an inmate education video, do some consulting with them on that video. They may want you to appear in the video so that the partnership is evident to the inmates and building trust among the inmates and seeking the victim services support. So with that, we're really wrapping up the content part of the webinar, and we know that we just jammed a lot of information into the last hour and 5 minutes, and want to get to your questions. So let's roll into the questions. Leah?
Okay, so feel free to continue to ask your questions now, but we already received a lot of questions, so I'm just going to roll right into them. What do you do when the inmate can only make calls that are on their specific call list?
Okay, Leah, this is Gwen. I'd be happy to take that one. You need to work with the facility and their phone provider and talk to them about expanding the call list, the authorized call list, to make sure that your hotline phone number is included on that call list so that any inmate in that facility can access your phone line. You also have to find out if you have no negotiated MOU, or if you have a negotiated MOU, revisit the language. Find out if the line is unmonitored, unrecorded. If it is not unmonitored or unrecorded, and that's something that you want, you need to be sure that you're looking at the technological aspects of how those phone calls are routed. So as Nicole mentioned earlier, an inmate has to enter an individual PIN number, personal identifying number, into the phone system to access an outside line. So when they're doing that, if you want it to be truly confidential, you want to work it out with the phone provider for that to be able to be a universal PIN to be set up to happen. We have this currently in our partnership with an inside line that we operate for, which is a direct services hotline for the Michigan Department of Corrections and all their prisons. It can be done. I saw someone, I think Megan, one of the Megans who's listening today, mentioned Global Telink. Maybe it wasn't you, Megan, but someone mentioned Global Telink, and that their DOC, there was some concern about their DOC not saying that their Global Telink partner couldn't do something with them. Well, actually, Global Telink is the partner in Michigan, and in fact, it's working very well in Michigan. The issues that we had when we launched the support line were very quickly resolved with the support of Global Telink and our Michigan DOC partner. I know that California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation uses Global Telink for all of the California prisons, and they are providing unrecorded, unmonitored, free calls for all the inmates in the California prisons to the local rape crisis centers, the victim services support centers in the community, so that the incarcerated individuals can make calls to those support lines as needed. And by the way, the Michigan calls are free as well.
And this is Nicole. I just want to add, in addition to the universal PIN that Gwen mentioned, which is what we're doing through Inside Line, a lot of agencies also have like a shorter, I don't even know what to call it, a PIN or a code. But for example, I think I mentioned during the webinar, like pound 55, and that would just bypass any, list that survivors may have, any call list. So that's what we want ideally, is for those calls to just be able to bypass, because like Gwen said, that would take away the ability for it to be anonymous or confidential.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah.
The next question we received is, we also have had trouble with facilities requiring inmates or detainees to pay for their calls to our organization. Are there ways around this?
We had this come up earlier on in one of the states, and again, we reached out to the state PREA coordinator. We coordinated with the facility, local facility PREA compliance manager. They immediately got on it with their the powers that be there and with their phone provider, and they were able to get it switched, and now it's unmonitored, unrecorded, and free. Not all are going to be able to do that. We had one, we were working with one state agency, one state Department of Corrections, trying to work something out that it could be provided unrecorded, unmonitored, and free. And it happened that that particular contract that they had, that the Department of Corrections had with their phone provider, part of the question was, well, if there's a high volume of calls going to the hotline, and it impacts the cost to someone's going to bear the cost. So who's going to bear the cost? Is it going to be the Department of Corrections? Is it going to be the if you have a toll-free number at your rape crisis service, well, you're paying for the toll-free, but you have a local line that the caller is placing the call to, then is it going to be the Department of Corrections? Is the local corrections agency paying for that call, or is it going to be the phone service provider? And that's going to have to come down to negotiation between those two parties, the corrections party and the phone service provider. In this particular situation, the two of them could not come to a mutually agreeable point where they, in terms of their existing contract, and basically came down to, no, we're not going to be providing unmonitored, unrecorded free calls, and thus the service is not in place even at this point. It's still available for inmates to, or an incarcerated survivor who needs to make a call. They can still call out to a local rape crisis center, but it's as though they call any other call. I mean, they will work to arrange the line so that that is an authorized number on their call list, but they have to pay for it. The inmate or their family has to pay for it.
And I would just add, this is Nicole again, to use the PREA standards as a tool. In the standards, it does say, you know, that facilities need to provide free, I can't remember exact language right now, but free and confidential outside support services. So I would definitely encourage those of you who are, you know, sort of unable to reach that agreement with your facilities to flag that for them.
One of the things, though, that you might get back on that, I mean, I definitely agree with Nick that you should try that, because you may be able to encourage them to do that. One of the things they may say, though, is that, well, that can be done through letter writing. So just be aware that they may say, yeah, well, we'll allow our inmates to write out to Just Detention International, for instance, or to your agency. You may say, well, we don't have the capacity to respond to letters to provide that emotional support through letter writing back and forth with an incarcerated survivor. Our hotline's already in place, and we'll respond to calls. Or you may say, yeah, we'll be happy to respond to written letters. I don't know, that's a conversation, again, that you'll have to have. But be aware that they may say, because the standards don't specify that it has to be verbal hotline support versus written letter.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next question we received is, do you have any advice on specific language that can be used to redirect off-topic callers? And I know this could be quite a lengthy answer, so I wondered, do you have any JDI-specific resources to address this, or maybe this is a publication or webinar we want to do in the future? I don't know.
I can share what we've been saying.
Yeah.
Well, I can share what I don't know that we have any specific materials, but I mean, I think it depends on what the off-topic call is.
Yeah.
But generally what we do is, we say, unfortunately, our hotline is for X, Y, and Z. We explain that it's a hotline for crisis intervention and counseling, and that unfortunately that's not something that we can help them with. And I think, that usually hopefully would work. If it's someone abusing the line and continuously calling to try to get you guys to, I don't know, call their family or buy their commissary or something that's, consistent and really disrupting your staff or taking away time that you could otherwise be on the call with someone in need, then I think that's something that, you would need to address with your facility directly.
Someone asked, how many inmates are also victims?
Do you want me to take that one?
Sure.
There's not very recent data, unfortunately. The Bureau of Justice Statistics under the Department of Justice has done some national surveys in the past. The most recent one was conducted from 2011 and 2012. And what that showed was that about 4% of adults in prisons and jails had reported or disclosed sexual abuse in the last 12 months. But of course, and that's just to put that in perspective, that's over 200,000 people in the U.S. in custody. But as you all can imagine, we assume that number is actually quite higher. That 4% is pretty low.
Just as in the community, we know it's underreported. We know too in facilities it's underreported.
Someone else asked, is there a PREA hotline available for advocates to use if they have questions about anything PREA related?
Well, I don't know that you would call it a PREA hotline. There's the PREA Resource Center, the National PREA Resource Center. You can find them online, the PREAResourceCenter.org. And you can also always call Just Detention International, or you can locate us online as well, and we'll provide our contact information at the end of the call. And I know we'll be happy to assist.
Thank you. The next question is, do you have any advice for safety planning while incarcerated and potentially having to be around the abuser, whether it's an officer, a DOC employee? Does JDI have any resources for safety planning in an incarceration environment?
Yeah, yes, actually we do. On our website, we have a guide called Hope for Healing, and it's downloadable so that if you and any of your facilities are working, your agencies are working with incarcerated survivors in facilities, you can provide that to them depending upon what the facility will let you provide to them. We send it out in packets when we talk to incarcerated survivors or we receive letters from incarcerated survivors and we know that they would like resources and information. There's a lot of information in there about how to, oh, there you go. You can see it on your screen now.
I thought it'd be helpful.
Well, this is an advocate's guide to helping survivors of sexual abuse in detention. We have that guide. We also have a guide that's specific for the survivor called Hope for Healing, and it also has information in there about how to help keep yourself safe, because it is very difficult for them to escape from their abuser while they're in an incarcerated setting. We certainly hope that corrections officials are following through with the protocol for separating the abuser and the survivor, and including in housing and programming and other such things. But we know all too well that it doesn't happen enough, and also that there are the survivors that don't report and they remain in proximity of their abuser.
The next question we received is, what is best practice for MOUs about hotline language? And I think just for time's sake, I'll just say that JDI has multiple MOUs, sample MOUs available on their website that I think can address a lot of those questions. And as with every question that's been asked today, if you have more specific questions or you just want to talk about it more in depth, you're of course welcome to email or contact any one of us at the RSP or JDI to talk further.
Yes, and I just want to mention about anytime you use a template for anything, be really mindful again to have those thorough conversations with the agency that you're working with, the corrections agency, and within your own capacity and your knowing your organization, because there isn't a one size fits all. You really have to customize it. I mean, it'll give you ideas on way to approach things, but really be mindful and like I said, have those conversations about things like the term confidentiality. What does that mean to you? This is what it means to us. Make sure you understand those things because it can trip you up.
Great point, thank you. The next question received is, we frequently have survivors call about sexual violence and abuse from facility staff or inhumane treatment, refusal of necessary medical care, for example, after an assault, or punishing survivors with isolation. We work exclusively with queer and trans survivors, and have had virtually no luck supporting survivors in holding their institutions accountable. How can, if at all, MOUs address this state-sanctioned violence that the majority of our incarcerated and detained callers are seeking support for?
This is Gwen. I would definitely encourage in the MOU process to, you can reference language from the standards in terms of articulating protocol for proper housing for survivors, proper treatment and protocol for working with special populations, with trans survivors. I think that, you know, if you're running into those kinds of situations, and I'm so sad, very sad to hear that this is what's happening, and thank you for the work that you're doing and advocating on their behalf. You know, reach out to the Attorney General's office in that state, reach out to the Ombudsman's program through the department, because, and if you've already tried that, you know, please just, you do your work well, don't give up, because we're making advances in PREA, where it's been on a law for 15 years, and we, believe it or not, are really far beyond where we were when we started 15 years ago. There's so much more work to be done, but I'm very hopeful, because we have seen progress, and we've seen progress even in the audit process. The Department of Justice has revamped and still is continuing to work on revamping the auditor tools, the rigors for the training requirements, and the ability for an individual to be certified to be a U.S. Department of Justice certified PREA auditor. Those are all really important steps, and so please encourage you just to stay the course. You can also reach out to Detention International and make us aware of your plight, and we'll have our Director of Advocacy be in touch with you.
Thank you. The next question we received is, what do you suggest when you're dealing with resistance from the jail/detention center staff members? For example, a staff member indicating that sexual assault doesn't occur in our local jail.
Do you want to handle that one, Nick, or you want me to hit it?
You know, I think we've done a lot of work at JDI when we're working with corrections facilities on educating the staff on the importance of providing this type of service to incarcerated survivors. I think it really comes down to that, to educating them, to training staff on how, you know, not only do advocates, survivors feel more empowered to report when they receive the services, but it also it's about changing the culture in the facility, and so providing these services can really help do that. It's really hard when someone just says, you know, this is not happening here, when we know it is, right? We have data, and we're getting these calls, and as advocates, we know to believe the stories that people are telling us. So it's hard. I'm not sure that I have a great answer for that, Gwen, other than just continuing to provide training and education. And yeah.
Well, one thing that I think we're finding, just within the past year, to be successful, and Michelle, who's still on the line with us, I think we started taking this approach within the past year in Wyoming also, doing trauma-informed trainings, because we do find that they say that. And so we say, you know, okay, so it's not happening in your facility, but we know statistically that 91% of the women, and this is according to RAIN, that 91% of the women incarcerated in the United States have had some past of sexual violence before ever being incarcerated. So there's a lot of trauma going on in that individual. And I can't remember, 1 in every 8 male incarcerated, something like that. So we talk to them about, so let's talk about the trauma there, how trauma manifests itself in an individual, what that behavior looks like, and how you perceive that as a corrections employee with that individual and their behavior, their outbursts of anger, perhaps in your facility. You see it as this, when in fact it's really trauma. and this is what trauma looks like. And when you start doing that training for them on what trauma looks like, and then they become more trauma informed, then we start rolling back and say, all right, let's talk about vicarious trauma and how that trauma that you're working around splashes over on you and how it affects you. And direct trauma that you're involved in with encounters in your job day in and day out. And what about self-care? And what does that mean? And they get it. And then they start humanizing it. And then they start saying, maybe we do have it here. Maybe I've been overlooking it. Maybe I should go back and think through this a little differently. And we have been able to make inroads with people that before would have never considered it.
And thanks for expanding on I just said training, and that's what you meant. You said it so well. You read my mind. But I just want to add that you can also add this type of cross-training is what we call it, but this type of training into your MOUs where you offer to do that type of training for the correction staff. And we say cross-training because, of course, there's to some degree some training that your advocates will also benefit from the corrections facility. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Okay, we got this question. Staff called us to let us know they had shared our address with inmates and that we'd be getting letters that we shouldn't believe anything they say. How do we handle this?
Okay, so I'm familiar with this scenario. Sadly familiar with this scenario. First of all, at no time should a staff member, as you might imagine, call and bias something that a survivor is going to reach out and say. The PREA standards say that anyone can reach out for victim services no matter when they were victimized, no matter where they were victimized, whether it was in an incarcerated setting or when it was they were 8 years old out in the community. And they have a right, whether their case has been reviewed, reported, investigated, found to be unfounded, unsubstantiated, or substantiated, they have a right to reach out for victim services at any time and under any circumstance. So it doesn't matter. If a staff member were to do that, then I think, first of all, it's appropriate for you to let the staff member know those details. We're here for emotional support for any incarcerated survivor, any individual that's housed in your facility who wants to reach out to us. The PREA standards say that they can reach out to us regardless of whether their case is founded or unfounded. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to provide the services to them. Depending upon your relationship with the agency PREA coordinator, again, not the person at the facility, but overall the agency. And if it's just a small jail and there is no other agency, that is the agency, I would go to the senior most official and say, look, maybe there needs to be a little more training done with your personnel at the facility. We received a phone call, and it seems that maybe they may need to better understand that the population has the ability to reach out to us at any time. So, try to do it in a friendly, supportive way rather than confrontational, but that definitely should not be happening.
Okay, I think that is really all the time that we have left for questions. I know that you guys wanted to do one more poll, so I'm going to launch that right now.
Great. Yeah, and we can be quick about this one. It should look familiar. Yeah, how comfortable are you with serving incarcerated survivors at this point? We just wanted to see if the webinar has, if we've been able to address some of your concerns. And again, we know we didn't get to all the questions. But.
I know some people had to drop off to go to other meetings. But
yeah.
Okay, here are the answers.
So let's see. Yay!
Oh,
yay! We have no one else answering not at all comfortable, so that's amazing. I think there was about 10% before. So that hopefully those aren't the people that dropped off. I think that means we've covered a lot today, so that's wonderful. Great. So let's quickly move on through the next couple of slides. Again, we've kind of already addressed this, but just wanted to share with you all the specific address on our website, at JDI's website, where advocates can access a wealth of resources, including archived webinars, fact sheets, tools, and as we mentioned, some sample MOUs as well. The one specific resource that we highlighted earlier, here's that slide again. This is Hope Behind Bars. It's a free publication that can be found under the publications for service providers on our webpage. And again, it's a manual for advocates to assist them in providing services to incarcerated victims. Finally, JDI has a resource guide as well for survivors of sexual abuse behind bars, which is a guide that lists legal and counseling resources by state for survivors who are still incarcerated, and for those who have been released, and for loved ones as well, of course. If your agency is interested in being listed as a resource on our guide, please fill out the form found at the link on your screen, and we'd be happy to reach out to you so that we can add you to our guide. It has been a pleasure to present this webinar to you all today. Thank you again to all the attendees and for your participation throughout the webinar with your questions and answering our polls. Don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions or need any technical support. JDI and the Resource Sharing Project both provide technical support to advocates and coalitions around the country as you all begin to work or are working with incarcerated survivors. You can always contact us at advocate@justdetention.org, and we'll get back to you within 2 business days. Also, be sure to sign up for our newsletter and follow us on Twitter and Facebook for updates on our work and our resources. And yeah, Leah, I will turn things back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to OVW for funding this project. And here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me if you guys have any questions. I know we tried to get to as many questions as we possibly could today, and we did a really good job. But if we didn't get to your question, or you'd like to talk more specifically about your question, Nicole, if you could just switch to the next slide, which has my contact information on it.
Yeah, sorry.
Reach out to me, send me an email. We're happy to talk much more specifically about your program or your area or the detention facility that you're currently struggling with or having great success with. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, JDI folks, for coming, and for Michelle for bringing your expertise. And just thanks so much, everybody. Great questions.